A lot of people interpret my behaviors and make a whole set of assumptions that I don't feel are a very representative assessment of me. They hear me speak and they think, oh God, he's so confident and he loves doing this. And I'm like, actually, that's not really a very accurate picture of me. But firstly, we didn't know anything that anyone else didn't know. Us leaders who were charged with this responsibility, we didn't have any extra information. No one was giving us a workshop or a tutorial about you were making judgment calls that were just way outside your knowledge base and expertise. At least I speak for myself. Maybe others felt they knew it, but I didn't. And that kind of responsibility, and knowing that for some colleagues, the number one thing they needed was to get back into the office.
Welcome everyone. You're listening to the L.O.F.T Podcast, where leadership meets operations, finance and transformation. I'm your host, Ranil De Silva. Lead with clarity, operate with purpose, transform with insight. Let's jump into the episode. In today's episode, Inclusive Leadership, Blind Spots and Innovation, we explore how inclusion becomes a strategic advantage and how leaders create environments where differences leads to better decisions. We'll talk about psychological safety, humility, and why understanding our blind spots is often the key to innovation. I'm joined by Ian Shapiro, a global leader known for building inclusive, resilient, and purpose-driven organizations. Ian is the Group Chief Executive Officer of the Building Research Establishment, where he is shaping strategies for more sustainable and equitable built environments. Before this, Ian spent more than 7 years as CEO of BRE, leading the organization's work to deliver affordable, climate-smart housing at scale across Africa and Asia. Under his leadership, BRE reached millions of people and redefined how people-centered leadership and systems thinking can drive impact in complex global contexts. Ian's work combines strategic clarity with a deeper commitment to inclusion and diversity of thought, making him an ideal voice on inclusive decision-making, leadership blind spots, and innovation. Ian, welcome to the L.O.F.T.
Thanks. Great to be in the L.O.F.T, Ronald.
I love your beard. I think it's making you very wise. You're not only a wise man, but it's making you look very wise.
I appreciate that. I've obviously followed your facial hair approach to leadership. I've decided that's the only way to get yourself a bit of gravitas.
It suits you. But welcome to the L.O.F.T. You've had a really exciting journey. You've worked in different places. You worked in India as well for a long time. So I really want to get into the conversation about where your leadership journey started. So tell me a little bit about what you have been doing in the last few years.
If I go way back, Ronald, in terms of what sort of led me into this world, I was born in London and had a pretty parochial, in my world, suburban life. I enjoyed it, loving family and all that. But as a teenager, I went overseas. It was the first time I'd been outside of a couple of countries in Western Europe. And I went to Nepal, and it just completely changed my whole view of the world, just suddenly realizing what else there was out there, how incredibly ignorant I was. I was excited on knowing how much I didn't know, but it really, struck me, slapped me around the face, whatever the right term is, that there's this whole world out there. And really that was the start of my journey, my kind of exploration, that kind of striving to work in a kind of diverse, inclusive, social justice manner. And then that's followed on. As you said, I've spent quite a lot of time in South Asia, East Africa, elsewhere, and back in the UK, back in my home city now. But yeah, that's really what led me, I think, on this journey.
I really want to delve into your time, especially in Africa and India. Any particular stories that link up to your leadership style and approach?
So many moments that kind of come with you and you take. I think probably a really pivotal experience for me was in India. When I'd started in India, so I'd lived for about 4 years in Nepal. I'd been to India quite a lot. India's obviously quite a large place with quite a lot of people. So 1 in 6 of humanity lives there. So the idea that it's a country, of course, it is a country, but it's just got so much complexity and richness and texture there. And I went in a sort of senior leadership position, and I'd come from East Africa. I've been working in Tanzania in a similar role in Tanzania. Tanzania, also complicated country with its own diversity in East Africa, but nothing like the richness of India. And I think that I entered India as a leader in the same way that I'd left Tanzania as a leader, having been there for a number of years. I lived in Tanzania for over 4 years. So I was familiar with the portfolio that we were managing, and my sort of understanding, as much as a foreigner and outsider has that understanding. And I thought, so get off the plane from Tanzania or get off the plane in India, and I can just be the same person because I've got these incredibly wise insights to contribute to the world. And I realized really quickly that I just wasn't having that kind of impact with my peers. And I could tell that I was annoying them. Couldn't really work out why, because I was sure I was such a helpful collegiate collaborator. Why would they possibly not enjoy my contributions? But it took me quite a long time. And I look back on it now and I feel quite embarrassed about myself. But that I just didn't have enough humility about the setting. I felt, oh, this country I've been to a number of times before. I've lived in the region. I've got a level of seniority and experience. So I can just use that in day one. And of course, you don't really, and you shouldn't really, get that authority on day one. And I was behaving in a way that I think I expected it. And I guess I go through life as a middle-aged white male. I think that kind of can compound that issue, that you think that every room you're in, you've earned your status already. And yeah, that was a real learning to me. And it took some difficult, challenging conversations from some colleagues to help me realize that a lack of humility, a lack of kind of leaning in and learning, a bit more listening, a bit less talking, was a really significant shift for the kind of way I like to operate today, or at least attempt to operate today.
Very good. Obviously, today we are going to talk about inclusive leadership and innovation around things. So you spending time in Africa and Asia, and obviously done a fair chunk of work in the UK. How does inclusive leadership helps you to better manage teams or innovation? Is there anything that you can inspire us on?
Asking me to inspire us all, Rano, is you've given me quite a challenge. But I think the idea of inclusion is recognizing the limitations of your own knowledge and recognizing that we're all stronger for the interactions and the diversity of thought and perspective that others bring. And of course, we all know that, but can we live it? Are we sitting there waiting to give our response to the next question because we've thought about something and it's triggered a thought and I must share with the room this incredible insight I had? Or am I really listening to the question that you've asked me and thinking, okay, how am I going to be different as a result of this question, of this conversation, of this podcast? How is my leadership going to challenge me? And to me, that's a big piece about inclusive leadership. It's about the fact that each moment is we evolve in each bit of our kind of neurons connecting in different ways because of who you are and who I am, what experiences bring us here. And recognizing that's a kind of sense of shared humanity and a sense that we're all bring actually very little to the table, but maybe what we do bring, we can amplify if we take advantage of working with colleagues and other people bringing that in.
Can you tell us a time where someone actually pointed you to a blind spot that you had? Maybe you haven't had any of those things, but if you have, what changed as a result of that?
The example I was giving about in India earlier, I think this was a really significant blind spot. I don't think that what I was contributing to the leadership was without value, but I think the way I was contributing really meant I was offering no value and I think that was a blind spot, that I was working with senior Indian colleagues who knew the portfolio and the setting immeasurably better than I did. They'd seen international people like me come and go many times before. And, that I felt that kind of on day one that we should operate as on a level that's a really obnoxious and insincere proposition. That is quite a blind spot, to use your language, and to recognize that you've got to recognize what you bring in and most importantly, what you don't bring. And always what you don't bring is enormously bigger than what you do bring. However brilliant you are, the Steve Jobs or Bill Gates or anyone, what you don't bring is enormous. And so that is that kind of readjustment of yourself is a blind spot. I think I spent earlier parts of my professional life, probably my personal life as well, but let's not drag that into this, but of thinking that because I had something reasonably intelligent to say, that some gave it a standing that maybe actually what I brought into the room didn't justify.
Interesting you say that. I've always been a firm believer you are as strong as your team. So if you don't have strong, diverse views and people who gives you like really good advice on different areas and brings in different expertise, I think you can't be successful as a leader. Do you agree with that, or any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that is absolutely right, Ronel. It's also about how do you bring out those diverse ideas and those perspectives, because we've all got different learning styles, different ways that we like to communicate and contribute. And so the idea also that you assume that the way you operate is going to be satisfactory, enjoyable, impactful with your colleagues, it's just naive, isn't it? We all operate in very different ways. So I know that for me, I have some sort of core characteristics. I was going to call them attributes, but I think that gives them too much of a compliment. They're just characteristics. So one is that I'm really relaxed, speaking publicly off the cuff without enormous preparation, whether that's in a room of 3 people, a room of 3,000 people. It really doesn't stress me out. I'm incredibly, and there's nothing learned about it, just fortunate. I thank my parents for the gene pool or whatever it is, right? But the other thing is that I'm an introvert. So my actual personal preference would actually to be sit in a room on my own quite a lot. That would be, and because of those two things that are seemingly contradictory, but are both true in me. And I think many of us have these diverse counter indicator behaviors. A lot of people interpret my behaviors and make a whole set of assumptions that I don't feel are a very representative assessment of me. They hear me speak and they think, oh God, he's so confident and he loves doing this. And I'm like, actually, that's not really a very accurate picture of me. But then what's the reflection? The reflection isn't, I must go and tell everyone that I'm an introvert. Ronnie, did you know I'm an introvert? You and I have known each other for a few years. Have I told you I'm an introvert? No, that's actually, what am I misjudging about you? What have I not understood? And what am I assuming from the way that you present? And I'm making all sorts of assessments about the kind of person you are and how you like to contribute and what your values are and what's the right way to bring you into a conversation and when's the wrong. I know that about myself, but if my learning is only about me and it isn't about that kind of shared experience, then that's not a very inclusive leadership proposition.
Yeah, good thoughts there. I would have never picked you as an introvert, Ian, I have to say.
Yeah, there you go. And how long have we known each other?
For a little while now, and I first met you actually during COVID when everything was virtual. So I would have never picked you as an introvert then, because you like a good conversation.
Yeah, so I think introverts, we are able to talk sometimes. That is definitely true. But I absolutely am. And it's that, we assume things about people's positions. I would assume here's someone who's set up a really stimulating, super interesting topic as a podcast series. Okay, must want to delve into certain things, but maybe I don't know what the key drivers and motivators behind this are. What's this stretch journey for you? What's the learning you're looking? Actually, I don't think that you're thinking, oh, I must set up this series just so I can listen to Ian talk at me for half an hour. That's not why you've done it. Actually, how do we learn that from an inclusive leadership? If I'm listening to you and thinking about the kind of questions you're asking and where you're probing me, but that's helping me shape, oh, okay, that's Ronald's. I've got a kind of process from a leadership point of view. Okay, what is the messages I'm taking from that I want to bring back into the kind of answers, the kind of people, then the situations and the context you're working in where you feel there's a contribution that can be made. And actually, that needs to challenge my stories, my thinking, my narrative, my contributions, all of that.
Yeah, that's interesting. So fast forwarding your career and your life a little bit into the UK from the likes of Africa and India, and because of the current context around globally, a lot of expatriates repatriating back from various different roles, whether it's in the development sector, humanitarian sector, corporates, consulting space. How did you find that move back into the UK and settling into a leadership role?
Wow. Oh, wow. There's so many layers to it, aren't there? This idea that of how we interconnect, this is the first time, Ranil, I've worked in the UK, but I've always worked on an international facing job. So I'm in a new role as of like 100 days ago. So I'm sure I should have a 100-day plan somewhere, but don't ask me for one because that'll be a very short conversation. But this is the first job where I've got, which is I work at a super interesting organization trying to raise standards in the built environment, safety and security and resilience. But this is the first time where it's a UK based business. It does a lot of work in the UK, about half its work in the UK and half globally. And so it's really pushing me to think about what my role is in my neighborhood, in my community. How does that play out? But not just there, but then what are the global ramifications of it? And I'm honestly, Ron, I'm much more comfortable with the global ramifications of it because that's what I spent most of my adult life working in that international space. So I'm having to really push myself to say, no, don't forget the UK. Don't forget the importance of that. What's the contribution here? What do you not understand about UK housing policy, or what the nationally determined contributions of reducing carbon emissions in the UK, which are topics, frankly, that I've spent very little of my time thinking about. And of course, they're super relevant. And I'm a Brit. I was born here. I was raised here. So it's interesting, that level of kind of self-reflection and challenge to myself. How can I be an inclusive leader? I come in as the group chief exec of an amazing heritage business and think, how do I deal with my imposter syndrome and my contribution and think it's okay not to know lots of things. That's actually quite healthy. And maybe that's a good inclusive leadership proposition, to be comfortable with the depths of my lack of knowledge.
Yeah, it's really refreshing to hear that, Ian. You're a very well-established CEO, to say that it's okay not to know everything about an organization, and I'm here to learn and make sure that I'm being part of the team. So it's nice to hear that.
I also, obviously, it's true, right? We've all been new in jobs, right? And we all know when we enter a new job and certainly a new organization, just the myriad of things that don't make sense to us. The acronyms, I don't know how I suddenly trying to this morning get the printer to work. I suddenly realized I don't know how to get the printer to work, right? That's okay. It's all right to go around and to ask your colleagues, any chance you could help me learn how to use the printer? But of course, you're the group chief exec. Of course, you know how to do everything. You've got all the answers. You know you've got the 10-year plan and you know what to do. That's not an inclusive leadership proposition, is it? That's not, going back to the point you were making earlier. We are the sum total of the talents that we can bring together, right? And that requires that diversity, that different experiences, different worldviews, people who are accountable, but also encouraged to bring their kind of creative, responsible, performance-driven best to it, but also open to a bit of learning. And I think that I am keen to, and hope I do, can role model that. And actually constantly talking about my ignorance, I think, is quite helpful.
It's quite often that I've read, and also with the leaders that I've spoken to, vulnerability is an important part of leadership, right? So if you think about strong leaders, most of the time are very vulnerable in the things that they don't know or the support that they need. And the comment that you made previously touches on that. What are your thoughts around, as a leader, are you allowed to be vulnerable?
I think if you're not able to demonstrate areas of limitation, then you're offering a hero proposition. And Ronald, I don't know about you, but I don't see myself as a hero. I see myself as a reasonably competent, semi-intelligent, driven believer in a better world and making a contribution to that better world. And I'm happy to roll my sleeves up, or whatever the right term is, to make my contribution to that. But I don't see myself as a kind of hero who can single-handedly drive absolute change and clarity and reform of a global system and change the course of our approach to embodied carbon or retrofitting buildings around the world. And so if you know your own limitations, actually, that's an empowering vulnerability. That's a real strength rather than a weakness. So I'm really at ease with that. I recognize that I'm quite privileged to be able to demonstrate and articulate those vulnerabilities. You know, I'm a middle-aged man who goes through the world as a white person. I'm a group chief executive. I speak English as a first language. There's always been food on the table. There's always food on the table. So I've got a lot of privileges which allow me to step into a space of vulnerability. And I think that I shouldn't also assume that everyone else has those privileges which allows them to do that. But I do have them. And I should use them for allyship, for inclusion, for a recognition, because actually that sense of shared humanity and what my contribution to that is, and the world I'm looking to leave behind me that is better than the one I inherited, that is a role that requires decision making, but also a recognition of my limitations and my vulnerability.
Right. Often vulnerability and trust goes hand in hand. With if you are vulnerable, you can build trust. If you have trust, you can be vulnerable. We're going to explore that a bit more after the short break that we're going to take. At the Loft, we're going to take a couple of minutes off, and we'll come back with our discussion with Ian Shapiro.
We are taking a short break at the Loft. In the meantime, if you like any of our episodes, please subscribe or follow us at the L.O.F.T.club or any channels that you get your podcasts from.
So Ian, welcome back to the Loft. We spoke a little bit about vulnerability. I was asking you as we took the break, quite often vulnerability and trust goes hand in hand. Can you tell us an example of where you, in your career, that built trust with your team members, and how did you do that? What are the behaviors that you saw?
I have to say that, so the first thing that you've triggered in that question, Ranil, which I'd love to explore with you, is what do you do when you can't share information? So maybe we can come back to that, because I think that's something that I really grapple with in terms of the role as an inclusive leader, about what you can share and what you don't share. And sometimes oversharing can be unhelpful, and sometimes it's also the inappropriate thing to do for an organization as a leader. So I'd love to explore that with you and hear your sense of it. If I think about that, I really struggle with on that kind of trust, leadership, vulnerability area, really COVID, which is the time when you and I first met each other, was in that COVID period. But finding yourself as a leader suddenly responsible in a way that probably was always true, but maybe I at least hadn't reflected on that way, that you engaged in people's lives in a completely different way. Now, of course, as leaders, you should always think about people's lives and what else they have going on in their world and outside their professional responsibilities. But suddenly you are thrust into people's kitchens and living rooms and bedrooms, and suddenly you are tasked with this responsibility of offering sort of incredible wisdom on when we should go back to the office, and if we should go back to the office, how close should we sit next to each other, and who should go back to the office and on what days. And of course, firstly, we didn't know anything that anyone else didn't know. Us leaders who were charged with this responsibility, we didn't have any extra information. No one was giving us a workshop or a tutorial about you were making judgment calls that were just way outside your knowledge base and expertise. At least I speak for myself. Maybe others felt they knew it, but I didn't. And that kind of responsibility, and knowing that for some colleagues, the number one thing they needed was to get back into the office and have some human interaction, and that was absolutely vital. But for other colleagues, maybe they had health challenges or were psychologically more at risk or more nervous, that the last thing they could do to stay and feel motivated was to be told to go back to the office. Now, that's before you get into what the business need is. What's the organization driving to, or what's the purpose of your organization? So you're trying to grapple with these things. And of course, that is an incredible trust challenge. And of course, taking our two archetypal examples, the person who's desperate to get back into the office, maybe they live alone or they've got no space they can work in, to the person who doesn't, the last thing they want to do is go back into the office. How do you motivate both of them? How are you a trusting leader to those two people? Unbelievably difficult. And yet someone's got to make that decision. And that's one of the challenges of leadership.
Exactly. I think COVID did teach us a lot of interesting things. Like with, as you mentioned at the start of the call, every challenge I think that's been presented to us, whether it's people, whether it's politics, whether it's culture, I think it helps us learn and adapt into moving into new areas. You talk a little bit about trust, vulnerability, and when do you really pull back on information? When do you become very transparent? As a group CEO and CEO in other organizations, how have you managed to do this as a leader?
Yeah, I know you're supposed to be interviewing me, but I was really interested in your perspective on this, Ronald, because I think this is a really hard challenge. You've got a huge set of teams across all over the world, delivering, really pushing themselves. And of course, sometimes we've all got choice. Resources are finite, right? We can't invest everywhere. We can't give everyone pay rises. We can't not everyone can get all these perks and bonuses, or not everyone can get the promotion. There's so many choices which they're not, that there's a shadow side to all of these choices. And there's also that piece about us as leaders about what do we share, when do we share it. I imagine your sense of the business 3-year financial planning is not the same as other people, that what and think about those choices. So when is the right time to share that? What's the risk of upsetting, breaking trust, and therefore undermining your contribution to being an inclusive leader and having the impact you lead? How do you make those judgments?
I always look at this, Ian, as an onion. There's various layers to it. I've always operated in a way that it's better to be transparent and it's better to be honest and upfront, even if the context and the situation is not as healthy as it should be. I think that is the framework that I operate in. So when I use an onion analogy, core to the onion, right in the inside of it, there are layers that are very close to the middle part of it, is where you see the core information, the core group that makes a lot of decisions, right? So obviously the transparency and the information that you are seeing is much more broader. You're much more closer to it than the layers of the outer layers of the onion, right? As long as we can clearly, to the best of our ability, can be transparent on the direction of travel of an organization, or the financial situation, or the operating context, or the risk that we are managing, without panicking everyone across the board, I think that's a good framework to fall back on. When I look back at when we had the challenges of losing quite a number of US government funding, it was a very short turnaround time. We were managing a huge amount of risk, but the one thing that got us across the line is about being transparent, being clear on we are trying to do the best for the organization, not for an individual, but for the organization. And then we are using a lot of data analytics and context analysis to make those decisions.
Yeah.
That's how I approached it. I think that's a reasonable framework to have. How much information do you put out without being confident that information is at least 95, 100% accurate, is the decision as a leader you need to take into consideration.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I think I like your onion analogy, although I did worry when you started with the onions that you were just going to talk about making us all cry. That was my starting assumption with your onion, but you didn't, which was good. But I think you're talking there, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, Rana, but about that consistency of message, that consistent, whether you're at the core of the onion or you're the outer layers of the skin, but it's consistent, right? And I think that is a really important trust prerogative. And really what the conversations you might have with other people who are at the core of the onion versus at the different layers of it, that might differ because you might have different access to information, your ability to be more clear about both the opportunities and the risks and the nervousness that's there. That might differ, but you can be consistent. And what you mustn't do, or at least I feel we mustn't do, is be disingenuous. Like tell people that something that is effectively is a false or is a deliberately distracting narrative because you think that is the way to get through that short moment of that conversation. I'm being asked a difficult question, so I'll just, I don't know, sidestep it or whatever. I mean, that undermines trust really quickly. But of course, you get into leadership positions, you do have choices about when you give information and when it's helpful to give things. And that uncertainty is really difficult because there's obviously a difference between being misleading and holding him and thinking now is not the right time. It's not that I want to lack transparency, but I just don't think this is a helpful piece. It's an ill-formed, this proposition at the moment, and therefore I feel that would be unhelpful. But that's a real challenge. And when you're at the other end of that, you think, how would I like to feel as a recipient of this information or as a recipient of this lack of information? Going back, you were asking about India. I remember at that time I was a diplomat in the senior team, and we were having a serious discussions about what the investment choices would be with funding to the India portfolio. So it was absolutely fundamental to what the long-term future would be, what it would mean for jobs, impact, poverty reduction, everything that we were doing in the country. We were talking about many hundreds of millions of dollars worth of investment. So these were significant decisions in that world. And the cabinet minister, who was the one trying to work it through, decided that they didn't want to have me and a couple of my colleagues in the room because they felt that we would be too sensitive about it or too defensive, or we might be upset if we were talking. And so only my boss went to this meeting. And it goes back to your point earlier on about that idea of kind of collective leadership and how you get that diversity of thought. And I remember being like, just a bit outraged, really, thinking, I'm a grown up here, right? So I'm happy to don't have a difficult conversation without me. I might want to challenge you, minister, about your choices, but hear my voice. Then I'll respect your decision and I'll fall in behind it. But I want to make sure that diversity of thought and that views have come in. And that was a real lesson to me, thinking, what's it? I thought I was in charge of these hundreds of millions of dollars worth of expenditure and programming and activity and people, but you don't even want me in on the conversation about what we do with the next phase. Then again, going back to this conversation we had earlier, how does that play out in my learning? My learning is, what do other people want to hear? What conversations do they want to be excluded from? How can I expect someone else to be an accountable leader responsible for delivering complicated portfolios, but not have them in on the conversation about where those choices are made, even if they're difficult choices that might require discomfort?
Interesting. I think you touched a little bit on this, but what do leaders often get wrong when it comes to inclusive decision making or inclusion?
I think this choice of when to offer information and when not, I would say something I'm really struggling with now, Ranil, in my new organization, which I think is a fantastic world leader in many ways. But I feel a lot of the business is waiting for me to say to them, me to say to the business, to my colleagues, this is the future. This is what we're going to do. And I'm trying really hard to say, no, what do you, colleagues, peers, what do you think we should do? You've worked here longer, more about this than I do. And we're having a bit of a funny dance, I think, about this, where they're saying, not sure I want to say something in case it's not what the new boss thinks. And the new boss is thinking he doesn't want to say anything because he wants to hear what other people are genuinely thinking. And I think, so am I getting that wrong? You asked what the leaders get wrong. Let me ask myself, am I getting this wrong? Do I need to be a bit more definitive? Do I need to say, actually, I really think we should be expanding into Africa because 70% of the buildings in Africa have not yet been built that will be built in the next generation. That's where there's 1.5 billion more people in Africa's cities. And actually, if we're going to think about keeping the global temperature under 2 degrees, we've got to go in and help make sure that those buildings are built in a green, smart, inclusive, sustainable way. And we're probably the world's leading organization to do that. And at the moment, we've got almost no footprint in Africa. And just as an example, I could go in and say, I know a little bit about the continent. It's a big, complicated place. I know a little bit. I know enough. We've got a contribution to make. Would that be helpful? Am I getting it wrong by not saying we should do that? Or would I be getting it wrong if I said, I've only been here 100 days and I've decided, despite never having worked in Africa, that we should have a new pivot as the business and we should have a whole new Africa work stream? I don't know which of those is wrong. Maybe they're both wrong. Maybe neither of them are wrong. But these are really difficult navigations that you need to make.
Going back into your previous role, where you led an organization very successfully on affordable housing that's kind of climate smart and focused in Africa and Asia, right? From where you sit now, do you think the challenges for those continents when it comes to affordable housing, is it getting worse, or is there hope that we can head down a different direction, or is there anything that you can really support to drive that sector in your current role?
The challenges globally, it's interesting. We've got more information and data and perspective than we've ever had before, right? We all know that. We're all feeling it in our lives as information comes into us. We know what the demographic shifts are going to be, right? It's really clear. Europe is shrinking. There's going to be less people in Europe. Europe's built most of its building stock. So the questions in here are challenges about retrofitting, about restructuring existing stock. There is some new build, of course. But if you go into sub-Saharan Africa, that is a complete flip in terms of that. It's expanding incredibly quickly. I think the mean age in sub-Saharan Africa, I think, is about 19. Nigeria is going from just over 200 million people now to over 400 million in the net. And only, about 60 years ago, it was a country of 50 million people. These are complete mind-bending numbers. So the challenges in front of us, we know that. What's interesting, I think, is that we've got lots of the skills and knowledge to make a really collective difference that can be commercially smart, it can be profitable, but it can be inclusive and impactful. So it can think about vulnerable people and societies. The question is, are we brave enough as decision makers to step into those spaces? And actually, that's quite hard at the moment in terms of, you look at what's happening in the global context, that I would say the, in quotes, brave leaders are going for quite narrow bravery. They're going on quite sort of nation state bounded, quite othering, thinking about us and them. And to me, that's not how I see the world. It's not, I think that there's a collective humanity where we've got a role to step into. And I'd love BRE, the organization I'm at now, to make an outsized impact on that. And I think we can. But I think more broadly, that is about that inclusive leadership proposition that as you set up the whole podcast, this whole purpose is about how do we share ideas and knowledge and recognize each of our limitations, but to get a collective benefit.
So what's inspiring you right now about inclusive leadership in the future?
Obviously, your podcast, Ranil. That's the key answer to
Good
to
answer, Ian.
Yeah, thank you. Should I just stop there? Just stop for that.
Let's just cut it now.
Look, I think the fact that we're able to have these conversations does feel quite different. I don't think a decade ago we'd have had these conversations. I think that there's an appetite for that. I think that someone with my self-professed limitations gets put into a role of this significance is a testament to inclusive leadership and a willingness to take that on. And so I do see role models and opportunities of others that is energizing and encouraging. And I feel that I work with people who I feel inspired by their bravery and leadership to take that on and to be different support group and to recognize their fallibility, their vulnerability. So that's exciting and positive. How we channel that in a way that we all feel that we've got more of a sense of collective ownership. I think those are maybe organization by organization challenges as well as societal challenges. And I would say probably collectively, we've got to remain energized and positive about the future, but we're being challenged pretty hard. And so that is about showing up and being brave and recognizing that you still have a contribution to make.
Great. And if you have to advise some young leaders around inclusion and innovation, what would that be?
Wow. Firstly, I'm shocked that you're therefore implying by that I'm not a young leader, which I'm going to pick up with you separately.
I did call you a wise old gentleman before.
Yeah, that's good. I'll take that. I think that there is something that we look at in terms of these generational shifts and generational expectations. And of course, there's something quite clunky and generalized about that. But there's obviously also something true and worth leaning into and understanding. I think that the younger generation, apologize to anyone in the younger generation that I'm making these mass generalizations, but there is a much more value-led, impact, cause-driven sense of purpose and wider responsibility. I feel in my generation that was less typical. I think it's much more typical now. And I think in terms of the kind of organizations that people want to work at, in terms of belonging and sense of identity, where they can bring a rounded view of themselves. I've been with my leadership team earlier. I've had a leadership team today, but I brought in 3 younger members of the organization in to help run a few sessions, sit in and listen and participate and be a voice in that. So they're there at the top table. Now, haven't become tomorrow's leaders today, but you create spaces and opportunities for diverse talent to come in and look at how the role models and the peers of tomorrow have that opportunity. And I think that they bring, just today, each of them, there were 3 of them with the leadership team, just brought in such a richness in terms of their perspective. And sometimes you've got to call them in, and sometimes they're happy to call themselves in terms of the conversation. But there is so much that we can all collectively get from that energy and that purpose-led belonging from as a starting point that maybe helps us in terms of that intergenerational piece, that diversity of thought, that idea that there's a collective package, that we don't have the whole piece together. That's great. We can't be old and wise and young and incredibly driven at the same time. That's a perfect example of why you need a diversity to bring out the best of each of us.
Great. Thank you. So we're going to take it down a notch as we wrap up the podcast. So what exciting or fun projects are you working on, Ian?
I feel like a possible CEO cliche. You'll forgive me for being a CEO cliche, but I do think, how do we get AI to be the part of the solution into this inclusive leadership piece is a really fascinating element. And how do we lean into it in a way that we think about how it comes in and helps organizations who care about social purpose and social impact and social good in a kind of public collective way? That is exciting. And so some of the things that we're working on now in terms of getting tools that can allow us to deliver quicker responses to customers, lower cost products to customers, reaching much wider markets because you can use AI as part of that data processing element. I do think that is unbelievably exciting. There is a whole shadow side to the AI conversation that isn't for today's podcast, about who controls it, how that works, where the resources go, what the implications are for energy use. Absolutely. But is that exciting? AI in the best hands for social good, for social purpose, for inclusive leadership, that is exciting. And I hope that we can play a small part in that.
Great. Very insightful, Ian. Thanks for joining us at the L.O.F.T. It's been a real pleasure having you. Thank you.
No, Ranil, it's been an absolute pleasure. Every conversation with you is a good learning one. So I'm going to take this one as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Here are the 3 main takeaways from our discussion today. First takeaway: true inclusion requires active listening over speaking. Effective leaders must resist the urge to immediately share their insights and instead focus on genuinely listening to understand how they'll be changed by the conversation. This means recognizing that diverse perspectives and experiences from team members often hold more value than any single leader's contribution, regardless of seniority or expertise. Second takeaway: demonstrating vulnerability creates psychological safety. Leaders who openly acknowledge what they don't know and are comfortable asking for help, even a simple task like how to use a printer, create environments where teams feel safe to contribute authentically. This approach rejects the hero leader myth and instead builds collective strength through shared responsibility and mutual learning. Our third and final takeaway: transparent communication builds trust during uncertainty. When facing difficult decisions with incomplete information, like navigating workplace policies during a crisis, leaders must maintain consistency in their messaging across all organization levels. While the depth of the information may vary, being honest about limitations and avoiding misleading narratives preserves trust, even when making uncomfortable choices that can't please everyone. Our call to action today will be to embrace these 3 takeaways in your leadership journey. Thanks for joining us on The L.O.F.T. If you enjoyed this episode of the podcast, please go online, like us, follow us, and subscribe at theloft.club or any channels that you get your podcast from. Until next time, lead with clarity, operate with purpose, and transform with insight. I'm your host, Ranil De Silva. Until we see you again, bye for now.